Ms. Giuliani?
I wanted to comment on the Merced Shuffle because in my former life I was a consultant to the Assembly Select Committee on the University of California 10th campus, UC Merced, and UC Merced didn't open its doors until 2005, and then consequently we had the budget crash. So it's not that there's anything wrong with UC Merced. What it is it's a smaller campus. It's the newest campus, and they have a smaller number of programs that are offered. So consequently, students that are looking to apply to the University of System don't necessarily have the program that they're looking for that's available at that smaller, newest campus that we have.
Thank you very much for your testimonies. We ask that you will remain at the table. If you can just move over, we're going to have Nathan Ballstone from UC, the Chief Financial Officer, to provide his testimony and presentation. Thank you very much for joining us, and if you can just please state your name.
Hey, good morning, Chair Gibson, Chair Medina, and members of the committee. My name is Nathan Brostrom. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the University of California System, and I appreciate the opportunity to address you on the university's process for distributing funds to the campuses and update you the work on this progress over the past 3 years. Auditor Howell and Paul Golosinski did a very good job of providing both a historic overview of our budgeting and allocation process. So I'm going to focus on the changes that we have made and the progress to date in these efforts. Then I'll also be happy to address questions about the UC's budget manual and the issue of non-resident tuition. As the audit report described, historically, the Office of the President collected certain revenues centrally and redistributed these across the campuses based on university-wide priorities. These revenues included state general funds, tuition, overhead costs associated with research, application fees, and a share of patent revenue. Funds were generally allocated incrementally, as the auditor noted. That meant that an allocation a campus received each year typically consisted of that funding it had received the previous year and a portion of the new university-wide revenues, which were allocated based on historic formulae. Two historic trends are important in understanding how disparities in per-student funding developed. The first is that for many decades, the state funded UC differentially based on student level, with higher levels of per-student funding for graduate enrollment and health sciences students, as Senator Roth noted. This meant that campuses that enrolled higher numbers of these students in the years when UC was well-funded received higher average per-student funding. Our analysis of per-student funding differentials show that 90% of these disparities among campuses are associated with the timing and level of enrollment growth in both health sciences and graduate students. The second trend is a gradual reduction over time in per-student funding that the university receives. So campuses that experienced significant growth after major cuts began in the 1990s did not receive the commensurate per-student funding that more well-established campuses had. Beginning in 2008, and as the state dramatically reduced state support to the university, and subsequently non-state funding sources became an ever-increasing and larger share of the university's total budget, the Office of the President initiated a comprehensive review of how the university budgets and allocates its various fund sources, both state and non-state. To Mr. Jones-Sawyer's question, the Office of the President used to be funded by an off-the-top allocation of state funds, as well as a myriad of taxes on non-resident tuition, patent revenue, indirect cost recovery. Instead, what we did is we sent all of that money out to the campuses where core teaching and learning occurred, and we allowed campuses to keep all campus-generated funds, including resident and non-resident tuition, research indirect cost recovery, philanthropy, patent, and investment income, and that's all retained now at the source campus. We do redistribute, to a point that Mr. Samuels made, we do redistribute the UC funds that we use for institutional financial aid, so that a financial aid package at Riverside is identical to one at UCLA, regardless of the profile of students on that campus. Shortly after the implementation of this change, the university began the complementary and necessary exercise of examining the distribution of state general funds, and we designed this process called rebenching of base funding formulae that would address concerns about disparities among campuses and per-student funding that had developed over time. Three principles informed this effort. First, unrestricted state general funds should be allocated to the campuses for the purposes of UC's core mission based on the number and types of students they educated. In rebenching, we do employ a weighting system based on health sciences students and graduate students. This is not nearly enough to accommodate the cost of educating a health science student. So to another of Senator Roth's question, we actually get about twice as much money from our medical centers and teaching hospitals for medical education as we do in state dollars. Even so, we do allocate much more in state funds to a medical student than to an undergraduate. The amount of state general funds allocated per campus should be the same for each type of student across all campuses. So an undergraduate at UCLA should get the same amount of state funding as an undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara. And rebenching should be implemented in a way that brings all campuses up to the highest level of per student funding as additional state funding is provided, not by reducing funding at any campus and redistributing funds to others. We did have a system-wide task force with representatives from every campus and representatives from the Academic Senate. And at the time, Jefferson, we did consult with students quite a bit on the approach. And we recommended completing this rebenching over 6 years in order not to disrupt campuses who would be hurt by the process. 2014-15 is the third year that the annual rebenching increment has been distributed to bring all campuses participating in rebenching. Mr. Samuels is right. The amount that we use every year is $37 million, but I should note that's $37 million out of the incremental $119 million. So it's more like 40% or 35% of the increment that we use towards rebenching. So, for example, since we have started, UC Santa Barbara's per student funding has gone up 40%, while UCLA's, which was at the highest level, has gone up only 12%. The chart that you should have shows the progress that we have made to date. And as someone noted, both Merced and UC San Francisco are not included in the rebenching methodology. In fact, Merced gets a far higher per student allocation of state funds than any other undergraduate campus, even though it has the highest percentage of both Pell students, underrepresented minority, and first-generation students. And that's principally because they are a young campus and they do not have a lot of the other funding sources like philanthropy or indirect cost recovery. So I want to conclude this section by pointing out three important points. Unequal levels of per student funding at our campuses were the artifacts of historical changes in the level of state funding and the way that the state allocated funding to the university. In general, campuses that built up higher levels of graduate student enrollment earlier, such as Berkeley and UCLA, enjoyed higher levels of funding to support those students. And campuses that experienced major growth during the years when state funding was particularly low ended up with lower overall average per student funding. The university recognized these disparities, and we had already begun efforts, as the auditor noted, to correct them long before the state auditor's report. And we have made substantial progress towards equalizing state general funds across the campuses on a weighted per student basis. And we do expect this work to be complete by the 2017-18 budget year. To give a perspective on the funding, when we started this, there was a funding gap of over $2,000 between UCLA and UC Santa Barbara, the highest and the lowest on a per student basis. In the current fiscal year, that is down to $900, and that is what will be closed by 2017-18. Let me quickly turn to the UC's budget manual. The auditor's report observed that for many decades the university had maintained a comprehensive budget manual that allowed outside agencies as well as our own internal budget and accounting staff to clearly understand the distribution and use of funds across the system. This manual became obsolete as we started to rely more on non-state funds and other practices. But we do think it is a good practice, and we appreciate the auditor's request that we prepare a new budget manual. We are in the process of doing that, and again, we expect to have one for the auditor's review by August of this year. Now let me turn to non-resident enrollment and tuition. Historically, the University of California's level of non-resident enrollment was far below that of other public research universities. Our campuses identified this shortfall as an academic and cultural issue more than a decade ago, far before it became a funding imperative, observing that in an increasingly global society, Californians benefit by living and learning alongside students from other states as well as other nations. All of our campuses had set as a goal gradually ramping up the proportions of both national and international students they enroll while maintaining the priority we place on California residents. As state funding has dropped and funding to support new California enrollment has not materialized, non-resident tuition has become a significant source of support for UC campuses, which use it to increase course offerings, enhance student financial aid, and improve academic support services, all efforts that help our California students. To put in perspective, though, our core funds, which really constitute, tuition, state funds, and non-resident tuition and some other funds, is about $6.8 billion across the university. Non-resident tuition is about $640 million this year, so it is less than 10%. It is a greater proportion on some campuses, but of our overall core funds, it is still a fairly small percentage. As a system, as the handout we gave demonstrates, 13.7% of our undergraduates are international and domestic non-resident students. This compares to 31% at other public universities that are members of the AAU, so still far below that. However, as other panelists and the members have noted, these figures do vary dramatically between our campuses. Berkeley and UCLA, which have long-standing national and international reputations, now each enroll more than 20% of their undergraduates from outside the state. And this is a level they do not plan to grow beyond. UC San Diego's non-resident enrollments are approaching 20%, and they've also started to slow their growth. The campuses that have experienced the most growth in this area have been Davis, Irvine, and Santa Barbara, which all now range around 10%, and they've grown dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years. And as was noted, Santa Cruz, Riverside, and Merced still have low percentages of non-resident enrollments, but both the chancellors at Santa Cruz and Riverside do hope to increase those enrollment targets over time. Our goal is that over time, non-resident enrollment will increase across these campuses, although it will take some time for this growth to materialize. In the interim, we want to maintain our emphasis of committing to California students, which is manifest in several ways. All California residents who meet the university's requirements are offered a seat at a campus in the UC system. No guarantee exists for non-residents. Campuses are expected to enroll their full levels of funded California students, and non-residents are admitted on top of those funded enrollments. Minimum system-wide eligibility standards for non-residents are more stringent than for California students, and at each campus, admitted non-residents must compare favorably with California students that are admitted to that campus. At the same time we look to add non-resident growth, we expect UC's overall levels of non-resident enrollment to remain well below those of comparable public research universities. UC has consistently expressed its strong interest in increasing capacity for California resident freshmen and transfer students, and the long-term stability plan that the Regents adopted provides for growth of 5,000 California students. We believe this expanded access is critical in order to serve our mission of providing increased opportunity and social mobility to the next generation of Californians. That's my testimony. Happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I have a question. If you can please provide us with a response or an answer. The Legislative Analyst Office contacted your office or the UC to provide data so that he can adequately prepare and present to this body. And he asked for this information in January. And today he's provided testimony that he just received the information just yesterday, which didn't prepare him to adequately provide information to us. Can you please shed some light regarding that?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I apologize. I think it was a misunderstanding about the data that was requested. We have all of that data, both in our accountability report, which the auditor had referenced, but also in our comprehensive financial statements. I think our staff was working on data that was that they misunderstood what he was looking for, and I understand that when that was clarified, they did get him the data on Friday. Is that?
Yesterday.
Oh, yesterday. Yeah. But it was trying to replicate the chart that was in the 2011 audit report.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So it was a misunderstanding?
The way I understood it in talking with their staff was they were having some trouble with the data, was the explanation I was given.
Okay. You made mention regarding the 2000, or the state auditor made mention regarding the 2011 report. We talked about Riverside, Santa Barbara, Merced, Santa Cruz, and identified the high proportionate of areas for minorities that's being underserved. You talked about that is going to be addressed over time. Is there a measurable time frame that we can expect that's going to be addressed with the disparity that has been brought out through your own admission?
Yeah, and that is, I'm glad you raised the question because that is of chief focus for us. The goal is by the budget year 2017-18, there would be identical funding, per state funding and tuition from on all of our campuses based on the type of student. So a medical student at San Francisco would get the same amount of state funding as a medical student at San Diego. An undergraduate at Riverside would get the same amount as an undergraduate at UCLA. The one outlier is Merced. They are in a growth mode. They get a higher amount now. Part of that reflects that they just don't have some of these other funding sources, and they still need more help from the state and from the Office of the President.
So until this formula is implemented, we can expect that these campuses will still receive a disproportionate amount of resources. Is that my understanding? No,
actually, those campuses are just receiving more of the incremental funds in order to bring them up to close that gap. So Santa Barbara, in fact, is receiving the most in the system to address the historic inequity and bring them closer to an equalized level by 17-18. So they're receiving any year. They'll get as much as twice as high a percentage growth in their state funds as UCLA, which is at the highest level of funding.
Thank you. Senator Hernandez?
Yeah, I have a question. When did and why did the non-resident model move away from a distribution equally to all the UC campuses to just the campuses themselves? I mean, obviously the ones that are going to benefit the most are like UCLA and Berkeley. Why was that? What's the reason for it?
That started in 2004 and 5. It was before the fiscal crisis. The notion was in any of these things that we used to socialize, like indirect cost recovery or private philanthropy or non-resident tuition. They used to be a very small part of the state budget, and so they'd be captured centrally and redistributed. Research grew dramatically. Our research has tripled over the last 20 years, and the idea was that the workload where the research happens is on the campus where that research and the indirect cost recovery is generated. And so the idea is that you keep it on that campus both to incentivize the campus but also to reflect the increased work that they have from that activity.
Well, I mean, I understand that research is important. Yes, Berkeley and UCLA are known for their institutions. That's why everybody wants to go to them. But I also would think that for the good of the entire UC system, that money needs to be distributed equally so that everyone has equal access. I also understand that you made a comment that it's important to have diversity from international of out-of-state students. Well, we have a lot of diversity amongst the state ourselves, and I think we need to look from within the state to diversify the UCs and make sure that all UCs are successful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, when you look at it compared to I talked about other public universities that have 31% out of state. Our diversity stands out. We have over 42% of our students are Pell Grant recipients. The average for AAU publics is about 26%. Over 40% are first-generation college students. There's no place in the country that is like that for a research university.
We have Senator Lara and then Senator Roth.
Thank you. I actually have a couple of questions, and just to echo that comment, I mean, we are in the most diverse state in the country. All you have to do is look at this dais, and you can see. And so students can still get that diversity experience from within students in California. You mentioned, and the report also mentions, that unrestricted state general funds should be provided to UC campuses for the purpose of the UC's core mission based on the number of types of students they educate. So the mention of types of students brings to question the non-resident enrollment. How actively has the UC recruited California students within rural and urban communities compared to their efforts abroad? I know there's been several articles where we've sent UC recruiters to China 22 times. I can't even count the times they've been in Long Beach or in Los Angeles. So wanted to get your opinion on this issue.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's something we're very proud of. We have a very extensive student academic preparation and outreach program. From the center, we fund that at about $30 million, so it dwarfs the amount that any campus would spend on out-of-state recruitment. I think we spend far more time in California and resources, especially reaching out to campuses that don't have, or high schools that don't have adequate UC representation. One thing that the president started this year is we have a partnership with the College Board that administers the PSAT and the SAT, and there's a significant number of California students who do quite well on the PSAT and then go on to not take any AP courses or not even take the SAT. So now every student that gets a fee waiver and does well in the PSAT gets a letter from President Napolitano saying you have the ability to go to a UC campus. Make sure you take your A through Gs, make sure you do all the requirements, and then we're going to reach out to specific school districts that don't have high success outcomes in those areas.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think you misunderstood my question. I was trying to figure out. There's been articles and different studies of the UC recruiters going abroad far more than actually recruiting within the state. So I wanted to figure out, why is that the case?
Well, but if we look at the budget numbers, that's not true. I mean, they are traveling abroad, but they spend far more time and far more resources in state recruiting California students. And
how much more money does that cost us to send recruiters abroad than to, and then in terms of the money we spent trying to recruit students in California?
I don't have the exact number, but it's far lower than so these are the numbers of student recruitment expenditures from 13-14 in-state, and this doesn't include everything, was over $20 million, and out-of-state was $3.5 million. None of that was state funds or tuition.
I would like to see that data for the past 5 years, if we can get that.
Yeah, we'd be happy to produce that.
Thank you.
Before I call on Senator Roth, I think what you're hearing, and I'm going to echo, how can I feed my kid? How can I feed my neighbor's kids if my own children are going hungry? And so how can we do all the things out of state when we have children and students here that needs these opportunities provided to them right here at home in the most diverse state in America? Senator Roth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was somewhat struck by the comment that allowing the campuses to keep out-of-state tuition revenue is sort of a disincentive to maximize the attendance by in-state students versus out-of-state students. So having said that, is there any consideration being given inside the UC system to either reverting to the pre-2004 revenue distribution model where the out-of-state tuition was distributed among the campuses, or further capping the out-of-state enrollment at these popular universities at a level below that of 2004? I assume that's when the increase in out-of-state tuition, the out-of-state students started to ramp up. That's question number one. I'll let you answer that, and then I've got number two.
The actual ramping up really happened in 08-09, and it was a result of the significant decline in state funding.
Then that would be the action date, 2008.
Right. Yeah. And I think we have a chart in there that shows it does go up. And there have been various regions, and even the president has talked about wanting to come up with both a policy of looking at potential caps on either a campus basis or on a system basis. So I think that is something we will be looking at. The only thing we don't want to do, Senator, is to disadvantage those campuses that don't have non-resident at the current time. I mean, places like Riverside or Santa Cruz that are just starting to ramp up some of those efforts. I would also note that we do, continue to have enrollment targets, and we're in the process of updating those for the next 5 years. So campuses have to meet those in-state enrollment targets and cannot displace in-state enrollment by adding non-residents. That would supplant that.
Well, I'd certainly ask you to take a look at that, and that might diffuse some of the concern expressed by the gentleman to my left. The second question I have relates to this per-student allocation. You referenced patent revenue, philanthropy, other revenue that campuses are allowed to keep. And I keep going back to these statistics and charts we look at, and I'm just not comfortable that the per-student allocation figures on these charts really gives us an actual picture of what each campus has available and allocates to on a per-student basis to education and training. Maybe because I'm math challenged, I just don't get it, but would it not be better and more informative to make sure that the state auditor or this body has that information so we can judge on a per campus basis exactly what funds are available to educate students in the state of California?
Yeah, and we'd be happy to work with the auditor on doing that. The only thing I would note on that is that if you just look at campus budgets, there's lots of those that are restricted and cannot be used for the teaching and learning. I mean, for example, federal contracts and grants. Contracts and grants are now $5.4 billion of our budget. The direct portion of those cannot be used for anything but the expenditure on that research. There is a portion that is indirect cost recovery, which does come back to the campus and can be used for other purposes, but generally those are used for the overhead of supporting the research activity.
I think I understand that, but in a budget-challenged environment where we're trying to deal with competing interests and trying to make sure that money is directed appropriately, and we're trying to make sure that students in the state of California attain a quality education, hopefully at the school of their choice. Not always, I understand. But I think it would be interesting to note what exactly the per-student allocation is when you factor in patent revenue, philanthropy, other third source revenue that flows to these individual campuses. Because maybe the per-student allocation out of state funds should be $10,000 as opposed to $15,000 if we're trying to sort of balance the educational playing field here in California. And again, maybe my thought is misplaced, and if so, I stand to be corrected, and I have very thick skin.
Yeah, no, you are right on. Is what we are trying to do is we are trying to leverage all of our other revenue sources in order to support our core budget of teaching and learning. I mean, so a very good example is philanthropy. Our campuses do quite well. They've raised about $1.8 billion. 98% of that is restricted. It's restricted to individual specific uses. So one of the things that we're trying to do, similar to what privates do, is develop models of philanthropy that create fungibility so we can use it to support, things that are otherwise come out of our core budget. And that we hope would in some ways lessen the reliance on tuition or state dollars. And I think it's possible. It just takes time to develop that.
Right, and a UCLA may be much more successful in philanthropy efforts than UC Merced or even UC Riverside, and you don't want to disincentivize those campuses from engaging in that activity. On the other hand, perhaps there's some balance between keeping it all and then getting it all, or keeping some of it and then balancing out the state resources to some of these other campuses. That would only be my thought. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
I heard you a couple of minutes ago, say that how proud you are of the diversity within the UC. But looking at the figures here in the Sacramento Bee on Latino enrollment, there's also disparity where that diversity is. And it's stark. And again, at UC Berkeley, at UCLA, Latino enrollment is only 13% at UC Berkeley. It's only 18% at UCLA. And I think that if we look at other figures, other ethnic groups, it would be very similar. And that or lower. And that compares very starkly with the diversity at the other campuses at UC Santa Barbara, at UC Riverside, where we have 36% Latino enrollment at UC Riverside, and as I said at the beginning, now 25% at UC Santa Barbara. And if you look at the CSU campuses, they're even doing a better job. So there, I think, an issue at UCLA and UC Berkeley that needs to be addressed. I have a question about what campuses would you say have the most potential to grow as we look at California wanting to enroll more California students? Which campuses would you say to us have the most potential to take more students?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, we are working really hard on building out Merced's campus. Merced has the ability to double, but as you know, we no longer have state funding sources, and so we are looking to cobble together sources to help build out the campus. But that would be a major area of growth, and I would also. I spent a lot of time on the Merced campus, and I think it is a wonderful place, and I think it's will be a great growth opportunity for California students. The other ones that have a lot of growth potential, I was just down at UC Riverside yesterday. Chancellor Wilcox there, has identified they could go to 25,000 students. He thinks that they could even grow further if there were state funding for enrollment. Davis has some ability to grow. Santa Barbara just came through, as Mr. Williams knows, a 10-year process on their long-range development plan. They are somewhat constrained by that. And Irvine probably has some ability to grow in terms of all of our campuses will add more California enrollment, but those are the ones that have significant ones.
So I would point out then, therefore, that the campuses that have the most potential for growth are receiving less revenue per student. So there's certainly a lot of irony in the way we're funding our campuses.
Well, I would point out, though, that to what Mr. Samuels said, when this is done, over 90% of funding, of the core funding, will be done on an equal basis. So because it'll cover both tuition and state dollars. So if you're an undergraduate at Riverside, you'll get the exact same funding as you would at UCLA. It's really in these, only other areas like indirect cost recovery or patent revenues, where it does stay on the campus. And so I think we are addressing what was a, historic inequity and one that was not really, explainable.